contains so many of the names that I generate associated with ICL and its technical development. Now, thanks to Virgilio Pasquale, where is he, who's put the program together, I would ask you to sign the attendance sheets. We do invite people to join the Computer Conservation Society. This is, I think, perhaps not entirely a typical event, but then no events of the Society are typical. But they are certainly all fascinating to those of us who are interested in the history of our great subject. We need volunteers to join the committee, and in all seriousness, I would ask you to contact me or any member of the committee if you do feel that you've got a little time to spare for us. Now, lunch, as you've probably gathered, is available immediately outside, but I'll leave it to Arthur Humphreys to set the program out. I suspect, to the great majority of you, Arthur Humphreys needs no introduction whatsoever. To me, famous as the man who was the managing director at the time of the merger in 1968, and who, as it were, set the 1900 series on its path. Over to Arthur.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to start the proceedings. When Virgilio first showed me the draft program, it said ICT before 1900. I don't propose to start with Victoria, and I thought within just as the war ended. In 1945, the opportunity was presented to the British Tabulating Machine Company to visit IBM to review the future. The Christmas of 1945 gave the chance of a meeting with Mr. Thomas J. Watson and a delegation from the BTM, which comprised Mr. Vic Stammers, Cecil Dean, Albert Cranfield, and Harry Waters. And they sailed to New York on a very slow boat. They were entertained on Christmas Day at Mr. Watson's home, and he actually served his guests with a glass of sherry. There were always arguments between the companies on the issue of royalties, and this Christmas meeting did not resolve them, but set a program wherein the BTM would manufacture more of IBM's products and so ease the outpouring of dollars as encouraged to do so by the Labour government. There was also set in hand an audit of the royalties paid during the war, IBM alleging they had been underpaid. These arguments, physics to IBM by BTM technical staff, persisted for the next 4 years. And of course, there were many discussions reviewing the implications of computers. In October 1949, however, the BTM chairman, Crawley Philpotts, Vic Stammers, and a lawyer set out to New York with a determination to settle, if possible, all, some, or most, or if not all, the problems then existing in the relations between the two companies. During this visit, Mr. now Sir Crawley Philpotts actually got the knighthood because of the work the company did at Bletchley, although the work was done by Dr. Keane, who had to settle for the OBE. During this visit, Sir Crawley had a private meeting with Mr. Thomas J. Watson at IBM headquarters and agreed to end the licensing agreement between the two companies, which had actually been signed by Dr. Hogarth in 1907. The interesting fact about the agreement was that it contained a termination clause and could only be ended by mutual consent. Sir Rawley died shortly after October 49, so his final business decision was an event he did not live either to enjoy or regret. The new chairman was Cecil Weir, who was delightful, able, and inspirational, and later a key figure in the company's evolving future. He had been chairman, I think, of the Control Commission, or at least a member of the Control Commission in Germany, following the end of the war. At a briefing meeting soon after Sir Cecil's appointment as chairman, the then active chairman, Mr. W.G. Dunstall, an importer of ostrich feathers, explained to Sir Cecil that the agreement with IBM had been ended, but in any event, the benefits it brought to BTM were of marginal advantage. You could have access to all their patents and know-how, you could buy any of their products at 10% of their cost, and certainly in his view, said Dunstall, it was not worth the royalty payments at 25%. Someone, however, pointed out there was a further advantage not mentioned. Oh, said Dunstall. What was that? It was that the BTM did not have IBM as a competitor. I wonder who that was. And so the BTM was on its own, and as it happened about the same time, in October 49, Klaus Summers, BTM's only competitor in punch cards, terminated its licensing agreement with Remington Rand. And so also was on its own for the fully owned subsidiary of Vickers. In the early to late 1950s, BTM and Powers had loose arrangements with UK computer companies, supplying input and output equipment to them, and seeking possible bases of further collaboration. In 1954, BTM made specific arrangements with GEC jointly to develop the 1301 computers, which GEC would manufacture and BTM would sell. Powers had a loose arrangement with Ferranti with a project or product called Pluto. In June 1958, the merger of BTM and Powers was announced, and the new company, ICT, with Sir Cecil Mead as chairman and Cecil Mead as managing director, was launched in January 1959. At the outset, ICT operated essentially as a punch card company with electronic extensions. BTM had been successful with its range of electronic multipliers and calculators, and Powers with its electronic multiplier and punch deck, but its two main products, the Samsonic tabulator and program control calculator, were not successful, and the lack of which caused many problems for the new company. Be that as it may, Cecil Mead formulated a strategy of consolidating all British computer companies or interests into ICT. In the autumn of 1959, ICT first sought to make a specific arrangement with Ferranti, but Ferranti chose not to accept the recommendations of the joint working party each company had set up, and so the eventual partnership was delayed until 1963. In 1961, the arrangements with GEC were changed. GEC ducked out of the development of 1301, but remained responsible for its manufacture. ICT engineering was set up, embracing the GEC development product planning group, GEC taking a 10% interest. At that time, Arnold was not too keen on computers. Mr. Weinstock invited Peter and I to come and have lunch with him, and he said, oh, you've come to talk about computers, have you, Arthur? Well, we in the GEC know absolutely nothing about it at all, and I've just paid 50,000 guineas to CEIR to discover they know less than we do. In 1960-61, talks with English Electric and ICT took place. English Electric postulating that perhaps ICT sales force would secure more orders for their KDF-9 and 8. These talks were overtaken by a proposal from RCA, with whom English Electric had a very long-standing technical agreement, that a three-way arrangement should be made to tackle the European market for computers. RCA developed a strategy of heavy investment in the computer business, it judging rightly that it was of more significance than colour television. RCA had introduced to the American market the 501 and 301 models in a compatible range to be followed at the top with the 601 and at the bottom with the 201. English Electric were marketing the 501 as KP10. The possibility of such collaboration seemed to ICT worth taking seriously, but English Electric did not think so at that time, and so ended the three-way discussions. However, ICT entered into a technical agreement with RCA, as did the Ball Company in France. ICT also purchased RCA 301 computers and marketed them as ICT 1500s. The technical agreement with RCA provided scope for collaboration in developments and product plans for the future. In 1961-63, there were many talks with the Ball Company to examine possibilities for collaboration in a sort of computer common market. These talks collapsed when Ball, having decided on a strategy of growth irrespective of profitability, found that this did not work, almost went bust, and in 1964 were acquired by General Electric of America, and ICT at that time was also bought in by GE. In 1962, three significant events occurred. acquired the computer interest of EMI of 1,100 and 2,400 products, as well as customers, and applied a small team of hardware, software, and sales staff. 2, an agreement was concluded with Univac in the United States to purchase and sell the Terminal 4 in ICT's markets, and I'll refer to this a little later on. 3, the launch at last of the 30-to-1 computer and its introduction to the market. Now, ICT's product planning group had the formidable task of formulating product plans and seeking to specify products, taking account of the views and working hand of EMI and RCA engineers, product planners and plans, and of course the views of its own technical and sales staff. About mid-March 1963, I was told to visit Randy Packard in Canada to look at the FP6000 and to take appropriate colleagues with me and to make the necessary arrangements with Peter Hall. Peter Hall had been a key figure in persuading Ferranti to merge its computer division into ICT by using imaginative and determined pressure, and as a result, serious talks have been underway for some time since January. Accordingly, I set out with my colleague, Echo Organ, the head of ICT's engineering and production, and Tom Shepard from product planning, and with Peter Hall and Hugh Government. We travelled to Canada via New York, where I was introduced to the government lounge bar, where the twist was invented, and later I introduced them to another twist called live dice. The presentation of the FP6000 by Ferranti Packard staff was expertly done, and Echo and Tom and I were very impressed with the specification, and during the several days of our stay, very impressed also with the possibilities of enhancement into a compatible range. Echo returned home, and Tom Shepard and I went to see RCA at Cherry Hill and were brought up to date with their plans and problems. It was Good Friday. Returning to the UK, Tom and I met with Cecil Mead on Easter Monday, and I recommended the adoption of the FP6000 and the drop of our own developments, assuming that a deal with Ferranti would be brought off. Now here's the crunch. Cecil Mead said, if that's what you think, let's do it. This turned out to be a £2 billion decision. Work in collaboration continued alongside the negotiations for the sale by Ferranti to ICT and its computer division, and the deal was presented to ICT shareholders at an EGM at the end of September 1963. At the meeting, it seemed no one had any questions, but a 16-year-old lad with a helmet in his hand and 10 shares, I think, said to the chairman, "You've clearly paid too much for the business, so when are you going to resign?" However, the shareholders approved the deal. So for the rest of 1963 and into 1974, ICT, now strengthened with Ferranti computer staff, proceeded with the development of the 1900 range and to put it into manufacture. In early April, Basil Ferranti, Peter Hall and I were in the States for talks with RCA, Univac and others. Peter and I were invited by RCA to attend a presentation to be made by IBM, especially for RCA, as one of their important customers. Peter and I introduced ourselves to IBM staff, and this is what was revealed. It was the 360. Peter and I adjourned the RCA top management and product planning staff to review the situation. It was April the 7th. We decided the announcement did not affect, RCA decided the announcement of the 360 did not adversely affect their plans, and we recognised we were committed to 1900. It could not change anything. Thereafter, the rest of the summer presented a formidable task and challenge to the company, and particularly its sales force. Against all the announced promises of all the goodies in the 360, we were not in a position formally to launch the 1900 series, and the press unkindly but accurately pointed out that ICT was seeking to sell 1301s, 1500s, 1100s, 2400s, Orions, and Atlas, and described this as the largest bag of incompatible computers it was possible to imagine. However, in September, coinciding with the Business Efficiency Exhibition, the 1900 series was announced in quite a special manner, and the 1902 and 1904 models were at the exhibition and available for customers to see and touch. The announcement itself At last, because of the fun of the announcement, the company had one range of compatible systems to sell. What a change for the sales force. History shows having achieved all this, it had to be done all over again in 1968-74 with the acquisition of English electric computers and the new set of issues, bits and bytes to be or not to be compatible with IBM, the promise of a golden rod by the government wishing to face up to the challenge of the white heat of the technological revolution and urging the merger, failed to place the orders promised, and the golden rod gave more pain than cash. So much for the background and all the intertwining issues which led to the 1900 and the immediate steps and aftermath of it. All the intertwining threads, all the companies that were involved, all the ideas and all the plans, temporary, idealistic, were all put in one pot, but at least the issue was resolved by the decision to adopt the FP6000. Now, Peter Ellis will no doubt cover in more detail the actual plans and projects which in the crucial years of 1959 to 64 were open to the company, and I'm sure my other colleagues will enjoy making their presentations in line with the agenda. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Right. So we're in mid-April 1964 in Philadelphia, and I'll just describe how we came to this position of saying that no, we're not going to use any more RCA products. We're going to base a range on the FP6000. And the concomitant thing that goes with that is what sort of things could we specify which we were going to be able to afford to develop and finance the rental of and find the capital. And by the way, still in that mid-April, because we've been setting off to RCA to find out and determine what the product plans for the company would be, arrangements had been made by Salesforce with due perspicacity, they believed, that on my return I was going to describe to them. Just one day later, it really was one day later because the decision was made on the morning. I was taking a coach up to New York, fly back, and explain to ICI, one big customer, and to the margarine union that went with Unilever 2 days later in Holland. So what I intend to cover is what ingredients we've got at that time and how we'd go about blending the product plan with the ability to actually carry it out, the financial plan that went with it. And let's just remind ourselves first of all, as it stood in April '64, that as we look back, just over a short period of about 21 months, one way and another, we'd investigated over 30 processes. Some of them we had, some of them were in work, some of them were RCA ones, some were RCA developments, and some were indeed the possibility of bought-in ones. I just picked one of those out, the Sylvania one. We'd had a look at that time at Sylvania with Moby Dick, but the the thing that went with it was a product which had been put together by, of all people, Corning Glass, who'd got a float glass process like Pilkington's, and had used that as a substrate. They put an LBR over it, a laser beam, which gave the blips on the glass, and the process, if you think about what we're trying to do, was almost exactly the same as a CD-ROM is now. And there were people at the time who were saying, if you're going to copy RCA and then you're going to copy IBM, then you're never ever going to be able to deal with competing with IBM because of their enormous production volumes. So you had to leapfrog them. So this was one of the leapfrog type ventures. Well, you could do this just like Ferranti had done years before with Atlas, then that was the way to go. All those things had to be dealt with and kindly or otherwise investigated. I don't actually want to list all this lot, but we did in fact have 27 peripheral units, and we've got all the things to think about, so interfacing them and buffering them, and another lot were the tape formats. It's been written about several times. The fact that we had 18 different tape formats wasn't possible to take any one and go to another one, and we didn't have any universal tape converters and so on to deal with. So ranges looked a bit far away, although from November 1961, when the technical agreement was made with RCA, we envisaged the thought of being able to do that. So that was always the Valhalla that was to be achieved, but somehow or another, along the way, there was always something that stopped it. Now, I had gone through this lot with Arthur, and he said, when all things are floating, you're never going to be able to make a decision, ever. So you've got to knock some pegs in the ground, which was what he called it, and he's mentioned to you one of the pegs that he knocked in the ground, and I bring it out again for a particular reason. The 1004 agreement gave us those things, but rather critically, it gave us a margin that after we paid for it from Univac, it gave us a margin of £12 million. And that was over a period of about 3 years. So that gives me the cue to show what our company position was in terms of financing. I should just say, by the way, that Univac had arranged for us to meet on the 3rd floor of a New York hotel, the Carlisle, and I'd gone down from the 3rd floor to the 2nd floor, usually with the bucket to get the ice, not for Arthur, but for Dr. Rayner, who is the president. And when I got down onto that 2nd floor, there was 4 or 5 chaps who looked like all American fullbacks, all in nice grey suits. What are you doing down here? And escorted very kindly but very firmly up onto the 2nd floor. Well, in fact, President Kennedy had set his headquarters up there, and he was just about to say to Khrushchev's ships that had got the mid-range missiles coming across the Atlantic, we'll attack you unless you turn around. So all the world really was looking in on what was going to happen with this lot, and in the meantime, this was the agreement that Arthur was busily getting on the 1004, and an absolutely magnificent agreement. Especially when you consider it in context with the ICT financials at that time. And we were talking about a £12 million increase, essentially down that second column, the profit before tax, because all we had to pay out of that was our selling costs, and even our training costs we were going to recover by charging for training. The line down the bottom indicated it was a bellwether of the position we were getting into, because we were at that time spending 2.4 million, or had done in 1963, but the running rate of the projects that were in hand was something like 3.5 million. So we were looking for a £4 million future spend, and we had the 1300s that we couldn't make enough of, so we were making 1500s. So let's now change pace altogether and have a look really at some of the other things that we were wanting to use to decide how we could fill in that product range. Well, going back a little bit to 1962, RCA had carried out one of the first telephone surveys of what people were doing with the computers. They had 4,000 installations, and because of their telecoms experience, in between the telephone operators at the time taking calls, they were in fact carrying out telephone surveys. So we had a great deal of information about the way that computers were being used, the relationship between computers that were used for scientific purposes and for commercial purposes. In Powers, because of my background, which was as a chartered insurer, and also I was partway through qualifying as an actuary, my job in Powers was to look after the insurance companies, which essentially would all have huge files. By huge files, I would mean the Prudential had 50 million policies, everyone represented by a card. The Pearl was 22 million, the Refuge Assurance was about 13 million, and so on, around the UK, and this also covered into France, where we had 15 of the départements in the Crédit Agricole, were our users, and they had somewhat similar, these very large card files, and we were seeking to avoid always having to sort them because of the enormous time and encumbrance factors that would come with doing that. And as we went into the calculator business, the same thing was happening on the work in progress files in manufacturing companies. And Powers had it was called the Systems and Reports Department, so all the sales proposals had to be vetted. And those large systems, it was my job to go through them and say, why can't we do it a bit in a slightly different way, or rearrange the data, or it won't work, whatever. Hollerith also had a similar department, and that had been formed mostly to deal with the 1201s and 1202s. They're not mentioned very much, but there was 160 of these installations, which were full-blown computer installations. And somewhat about a year after that, manager of those two companies, I was also put in charge of that. So I was seeing all the time how we were actually using our equipment. And I was keeping records of trying to get the essence of what was special about them and putting that down. Really, I suppose, to help me in looking at the next ones. When the 1500s were bought, the RCA 301, this was about a £10 million order, and I was given the job in a week of turning, we bought 100 systems into, we want so many 10K stores, so many 20, so many 40, so many of this sort of tape, this sort of printer, and also so many of the possibility of a race random access device. So again, this was to try and forward estimate from the point of view of RCA using it in their production planning, how much we wanted of each of these pieces. And what I was seeking to do, because clearly we could not be running the actual application on a trial machine, because we didn't have a trial machine if we were thinking of a new one, but we were looking to do some benchmarking. Probably the biggest benchmark that we put together at that time was an invoice statement, ship to, bill to, stock used in the invoicing, replenishment of the stock, hence the bill of materials that came with the breakdown of whatever the product had been sold. Then the comparison through the bill of materials of saying, here's all the bits that make that product, how many have we got, therefore how much do we want to make up the new sets? And we turned that into a series of iterations, if you like, on the different parts of it, to be able to test some of the designs. And I shall come back to that in a moment. But this whole process, which had been going on as far as I personally was concerned, for a period of about 12 years. So I went to Samus in 1952, and through that whole period I've been doing this sort of looking at systems and appraisals, and particularly the larger ones. Now, in parallel to that, I found that if you ask salespeople how many they were going to sell of any product, then you really needed to have some way of checking it out, if you like, if you were going to put it in the model. And there wasn't at that time any sales process, sales system, which would record contacts, prospects, how many proposals you're going to put in, what your success rate is going to be on all these, how long will it take to install it, and how long is it before you can enhance the product. And you put down a few lead times on these, and I would ask the sales managers to give me just a few, while thinking about something else. How many of these do you have, and how many of these do you have? And then, when I would get any one of these estimates by itself, I would be able to work it both backwards and forwards and see whether 100 orders there really did match how many contacts they actually had at this time. So it gave a way of getting some credence into some forecasting which we frankly had not had. And I combined that with the appreciation and the knowledge which we put together through looking at all the systems. I heard about VisiCalc. I hadn't ever seen a VisiCalc spreadsheet. And in fact, I asked Fred Durnley, who worked in planning and was a systems programmer, if he would prepare me, if you like, a project model. And the model would take all these inputs, including the inputs to do with benchmarking, including the inputs to do with the relationship between contacts through install, through installation time, through when you're going to get paid. It included the ability to deal with machines that were rented, and therefore it was going to be 3 years before we could possibly see even getting our original money back because of the rental implications. And now I come to some work that had been jointly done and with other people involved, with Derek Eldridge and Dr. Bird, for something that would fit below the FP 6000. The model would take a great mass of these, and it would fish out from them, first of all, single statements, which are at the top. And so this was the project file 182, and it was running number 7 that they'd been working on, and it in fact had been done just a month before we were in the States. And it was the 1902 part. What I was seeking to establish was where would you put a split between 1902 and 1903? What kind of peripherals would go with that kind of a how much was it going to cost us? And you can see some of the costs down there, which one's out. All those came in as averages. Some of those were put in on individual lines relating to the individual parts of a number of different configurations which we expected to sell, but all in that category somewhere in 1902, 1903, or some area that would be below the FB6000. I'm jumping the gun a little bit to say 1902-3, we hadn't thought about any of those numbers at the time that this was being done, just like that. And you can see that the development was going to cost us £770,000 for those units, and it wasn't until 1967-68 that the peak outflow of money was required. Now you see this, some of the significances of the original set of figures I put down as to the long-term nature of the planning process in a company such as ours. And the amount of capital that would then have to be invested, I mean, it looks enormous. It was because of, significantly because of the financing of the rentals. And we also had a profitability index. Now that index was not a specific thing like saying that will be the return on capital or the net before tax on capital used in the business. It was a one measure, but which if you carried out the work in the same way, it would say this one looks better than that, and then you could investigate why. And the main reason why I first got that model put together was not really to do the arithmetic, because they did have people who would do it. To begin with, they would be very, very interested, incidentally. The people who you could trust to do it properly, because it was very important that you got right answers, were the people who, after having done 3 of them, would just get plain bored in doing it. And what I didn't appreciate was that they would improve what they were doing. And there really were probably improvements. But then, when you got an improved thing that had got some new rule in it that you didn't know quite what the implications were, or it changed something you had got, when you looked then at the previous one and looked at the index to see whether just what they look like, because you're doing a different sort of what if, or you've got some different information, you couldn't make the comparison. And so, really, my main starting reason of having the computer program was to get a consistent way to be able to do all those comparisons. Well, the next thing we did was to do something which, in spreadsheet terms, wasn't in fact done generally by all the various spreadsheets, which was to add these things in a 3D way down. So you've got project number 1 with all the X's and Y's along there, and then you add them down and you get project 1 plus project 2. And if you go on long enough, you're going to get all the projects. And if you put an estimate in as to the other things, the things which gave rise to where you are now, the sum of that lot should equal what your company accounts were. Because the company accounts for us in 1964 were still struggling with putting together horror of the powers accounting systems. And they thought absolutely in terms of a one-shot look, a snapshot, balance sheets a snapshot at a point in time, whereas projects, as you can see by these sort of timescales, go over a period of time. And that is exactly how you value life policies in an insurance company. You pay in for ages and ages and ages, and the money's being accumulated, you're going to get it back, and all kinds of different probabilities of it happening along the way. So the one way of looking at that lot is to say, we'll take the present value of all those transactions, and that would correspond to something like this. So this process had given us, and actually as I was in the US in April '64, assisting Arthur with his supply of big pegs that he was busily knocking in the ground, saying, it's FB6000, now what's more, we're going to make a range out of it, now get to it. I had already, if you like, something like a series of the way AA used to put their roadmaps together. You want to go from London to Birmingham, you go London, and you figure out how you go from London to Enfield or whatever. And you pull these things out of the map, put them all together, and you've got the total route. Well, we have got many, many of these projects that have been done, and they'd all been done, as it were, for real. They haven't been done in a theoretical sense. There had been something that engineers were working on, companies were working on, people were wanting to buy, sales were looking at sales forecasts. We put all those together and had this waiting in the wings. The next stage on that, incidentally, was that I put into that, call it what you will, it was a company model in today's words, but it was the addition not only to what we had there, but to put in administration and cost of financing and the type of transaction that went with computer leases, which added £24 million of facility to the company. Now, I can't exactly recollect how this came about. I had been talking to her and to Sir Cecil Mead about saying, I wonder how IBM do this. And somehow or another it had come about that Sir Cecil talked to, I think, one of the two younger Mr. Watsons. And they said, well, why don't you come over? In fact, I went to Poughkeepsie, which was where the corporate galactic headquarters is of IBM in the middle of 1963. And I had all this information and the programs and all the printouts that went with it. And I spent, I was going for a morning originally, but they said, having described the methods we were using, why we were doing it, and I was quite open about it. I thought it's ridiculous to start putting in code numbers and things in here, because what possible difference can it make to IBM if you're realistic about it, when they spent as much as on research as our total business was about, completely. And it was indeed at that stage a bit more than that amount of money. So our 2 or 3% at the time was really not going to make too much difference to them. So I described this, and they then said they were likely to do the same thing in the afternoon. They've got people to go, it was something like 4 o'clock, and we went on into the evening. And they, on their part incidentally, let me have how they went about doing the same process. It was comforting in some ways. It was enough to make us want to continue with that process. So, still April 64, but I did have, it wasn't all done just on, as it were, on the back of an envelope to say, this is how we're going to do the process. The following day, describe it all to ICL. There was one thing that I wanted more commentary about it, but this was engineering input. Was it realistic to say that using FP6000 circuits, that it was going to be possible to get something compatible, but which could be at a cost? And you can see had costs, because the costs were going to support the sale price and the margin, and that would be consistent with the selling costs we had at the time in the UK, which were just short of 10%, and 21% overseas at that time. So this sort of process did put some limits on what the engineers could design, and that tends to be my definition of engineer. Anybody can knock up Keith Robinson type devices. What you need is the man that does it for the right kind of cost that then becomes saleable. So I was looking for that comfort factor of being able to write a specification which didn't say how you do it, but that it at least looked as though it should be possible. And Derek Eldridge was with the team, and we went up on a coach, and Dickie Bird as well. And one way and another, they all, as I understood it at the time, were top grade circuit men. Not all these other things, but whatever other things they had, that was the one that I was interested in. And I said, yes, they thought it had been feasible, and in fact, we'd already had some discussions, and I've no doubt they were talking about those things. I had phoned home because, on that evening, because I knew we had a game at home. I think it was called L'attaque, which you had holders into which you put vertical cards, so that you saw a blank card when you were looking at the opponent's player, and he saw something on the other side. And I asked if we could get a set of those, and I had them sent up, and all these cards were produced by chopping out little bits from our brochures. So when I got to Putney the next morning, I assembled all these things and was able to describe to the people from ICI Billingham and Hexagon House, and there was a whole lot of central ones. So, starting with a small specification and saying, there's the central processor, here's the peripheral that goes with it, there's the peripheral that goes with that, and here's the comms box that goes there, so that if you want to, then you can put another one alongside it. And that general method of display was adopted, improved very considerably when Tony J recommended how the product would be launched. It was launched with blocks with nothing on them really, but just the fact that we could fit them together in all different kinds of ways. So we had worked out a 1904, which was the FP6000, and a 1905, which was going to be the scientific end of it, a 1902 and 3, and because of the background of sales of the different parts of it, because this is a very critical area as to where to put those sort of divisions. I think I described those and completed it going back on the aeroplane with the 2 and 3, and then the inevitable top cover, the 1906 and 7, and how that might grow. So the thing we had at the very beginning, which was 30-odd processors, we really looked as though we were going to be able to bring it down to something manageable. The company model told me something about the estimate of money. It certainly told us that we were going to be £2 or £3 million per year short on development. And I'm not sure it's going to be covered, but one of the enormously important things of Mr. Basil Ferranti was that he had junior minister experience in government, and he was able to make the strategy for eventually, I think, perhaps 1 or 2 years later, of putting a proposition to NRDC. So we got £5 million funding, which started to deal with that end of the paying for what we had determined we had to do. And now you'll hear how everybody else does it for us.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've now got another interesting talk by David Eldridge and Hugh Deverell. I don't know how we're going to do it in combination, but it's a selection of the FP6000 architecture. You, as I mentioned earlier, and Peter Hall, with me and Thomas Evans, once the founding fathers of the ICT operations of the 1900s. So it gives me great pleasure to see you again, and also to Derek Eldridge. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My brief is to sketch the background and events that led to the adoption by Ferranti in the first place, and of course, as you well know, ICT later, of the FP6000 system. I must warn you that these are my recollections, and my memory is a bit like the computer memories of the 60s. It's not exactly perfect. And if some of you have different recollections, I'm sure you'll have an opportunity in discussion later to correct me and perhaps other speakers in what we believe to be correct. In the early 60s, Ferranti had a number of computer designs developed independently by different divisions and indeed by groups within divisions. And these covered machine tool control, various military systems, an airline seat reservation, and numerous general purpose machines. These latter included Pegasus and Mercury from the late 50s, Atlas and Sirius from 61, and Orion and the FP6000 from 63, and the last name, as you know, came from the Ferranti-Packard, the Ferranti subsidiary in Canada. Several of us in Ferranti at that time felt perhaps that the Ferranti family were really running a charitable institution to enable budding computer designers to let their hair down and do things. We didn't quite see at that time perhaps the full marketing implications of things. But in 1963, Ferranti had perceived marketing need for the UK and its small export market for a system that could follow on from the medium price, in the medium price range, and follow on to the reasonably successful Pegasus, Mercury, and Sirius machines. Some preliminary specification work had been done in the UK by Harry Johnson on the sales side, and the researchers, John Eilif and others, were having ideas of things like the basic language machine. However, what was lacking was a sense of urgency that was needed to produce a system quickly. And just before this time, parties from Ferranti-Packard, Fred Longstaff and others, had come to the UK to see the Ferranti UK ideas, including features of Orion. And after a very lengthy visit in the UK, they returned to Canada, and helped by some recruits they found from the UK on the way, they set to and designed and produced in quick time the FP6000, using engineering techniques already proven in their seat reservation system. The first FP6000 was installed and running in March '63 at the US Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and this was probably 2 years ahead of any other project that Ferranti UK could initiate. This success with the FP6000 prompted a visit to Canada by a team from the UK, myself and Delegovic and some others, and we were there to study all aspects of the FP6000, its design, its programming to date, its availability of software and so on, and maintenance and installation problems, with a view to assessing the system's suitability with some modification if necessary for manufacture and marketing in the UK. On our return in March '63, we wrote a report. I see a copy is available for anyone to study there. And having written it, I think it's not a bad report to read over the years. And we certainly recommended that Ferranti UK should adopt the FP6000 as its ongoing system. One paragraph from the report summarizes our findings. We said there are certain facets of the system we do not like. However, were we to begin designing now a machine in the same price-performance range as the FP6000, we would have in some 18 months' time a system that would not be significantly better, if indeed it were any better, than the FP6000 itself. And of course, I think the knowledge now that I hadn't got at that time, the machine was also of significance in any discussions that were going on between Ferranti and ICT. Very soon after the publication of the report, there was a visit to New York and Toronto by a joint Ferranti ICL ICT team, which Arthur has referred to. And there can be little doubt, as Arthur said, that the ICT representatives were quite impressed with what they saw. And if Arthur would allow me to tell a little story about that visit, I think it sums up the fact that we on the Ferranti side thought the FP6000 had won. I remember meeting Peter Hall at Heathrow before we set off on this visit, the travel arrangements having been made by ICT, and Peter was wondering whether we would be travelling out first class or economy. I think Peter, as the Ferranti director, was probably used to first class travel. However, when Arthur and Tom Shepherd arrived, we travelled economy. Nothing wrong with that, it's a very pleasant journey out. But when we returned to New York from Toronto, one of Arthur Humphrey's first actions in going to the ICT office in New York was to get a secretary to upgrade our return tickets to first class. And I felt that summed up the visit, and then I felt confident the FP6000 would indeed picture in ICT's future plans. The FP6000 with new software and peripherals became the Ferranti ICT 1900 ahead of the range, and of course later it became the 1904 in the range. And of course, as Derek Elder will say in a moment, through the ingenuity of UK computer designers, ways were found to produce larger and smaller versions, and the whole became the 1900 series. So I'll kindly hand over to Derek and take the story a little further.
We may so far have the impression that within ICT there was a very professionally run company, which indeed it was at that time, while in Ferranti there were gentlemen designing a whole range of machines, and the only thing that limited any further development was that they were running out of names of galactic structures. I would actually like to take a slightly different perspective, neither a Ferranti perspective nor an ICT perspective, but rather an IBM perspective. I'm probably regarded as a Ferranti type within a rather tribal organization, which then was ICT. Nobody ever lost their label. But in reality, I was actually an IBMer. I had spent 3 years with Ferranti initially, working mainly though on the military side. I can't possibly comment on what I was doing, to say that it's all really a waste of time, nothing to do with ferrite cores going up into space because they were more radiant resistant than transistors or valves. So when I came back to Ferranti after 3 years, having joined IBM and spent 6 very interesting years there, there was no shortage of ideas, but I think it's worth just reflecting, boring you on sort of personal history as to why I came back. I enjoyed my 6 years with IBM, and I believe I made a small contribution to their new SLT series. You may or may not know what that means. It's named after the solid logic technology which they had developed for what was to become the 360 series. But I missed the atmosphere of Ferranti, including the inventiveness of the people and being closer to the centre of things. IBM was a very large organisation. But before rejoining Ferranti, I felt that I needed reassurance that the rumoured merger with ICT, sorry, it was rumoured, probably somebody had stamped the document top secret, which is, as we know today, the best way of making sure that it's widely publicised. I need reassurance that this merger was actually going to take place. And Hugh Devenall and Peter Hunt, who were running Lily Hill at that time, were able to get me that assurance. I now know from what has already been transpired that I was able, where that assurance came from. Well, I knew that at the time. I was sitting a million miles away there, the arms folded at the front. But I didn't realise why he was able, in confidence, to give that reassurance indirectly. He was the main protagonist, I gather, behind wanting the merger to happen. Now, it wasn't just a question of concern that I had for the viability of Ferranti, though, as already been alluded, many people have said, and I'm sure this comes from Arthur, their motto of first into the future in today's publicly quoted companies will probably be translated as first into the red. I'm sure you said something like that, Arthur. It was that IBM was about to make a major gamble aimed at replacing virtually all their computers with a new compatible range. And I'd like to stress this gamble was implied in a new range. If they succeeded, their competitors would require an imaginative response, which I had every confidence would be devised, financial strength and marketing muscle, and Peter Ellis has excellently described ICT's capability in that respect at that time. Only the first of these, the imaginative response, was probably assured within Ferranti, and I assume that Peter Hall was of a similar mind at the time as to why he believed that merger was necessary. The concept of a compatible range seems obvious now, but it wasn't then. Peter has mentioned that it was I think, believe me now, I mean, it was an objective about how we hope to have one day. And indeed, I spoke to somebody who's not here, a small indirect part of it, Ted Brownfox, on Sunday, and asked the question to him, was there any talk of a compatible range within Ferranti at that time? This is, we're talking about sort of summer of '62 now. He said, well, yes, I had the idea as well, that I'd like to have had it, but I realised that it was an unrealistic objective. Always people inventing machines all around the place and vying for attention. So it wasn't as obvious then as it now seems. The development, launch and marketing of just one new machine at a time was a formidable enough venture. You when you look at some of the figures that Peter put up on thing to realise that, they really was a major investment. And even large car manufacturers, let's reflect, today take this approach, one machine at a time. I mean, the idea that they would say, all our Fords are now obsolete, we've now got this new galactic range, which is going to replace the lot. And of course, know that you won't buy any of our existing machines anymore, and you know that we can't deliver these machines for another 2 or 3 years, the new cars or whatever. But nevertheless, we're telling you we're going to do this and taking this huge gamble financially and in every other way. So consequently, while they couldn't take the risk of obsoleting all their existing models in one go, IBM decided they would. And it was such a gamble that I didn't find it very easy to convince people that a response within ICT with a compatible range was necessary. I mean, people like Peter didn't need convincing that it would be desirable, but it was necessary and urgent because we didn't have very much time. Now, why was it, in fact, that IBM took this enormous burden? I wasn't at the centre of things within IBM, so to some extent I have to sort of speculate. But from the conversations that I had then and since, I have to highlight two things. Few people, I think, and I include myself amongst these, have contemplated the enormous burden that software development would become. I mean, you know, in those days, we'll need a COBOL compiler, of course, and we'll be an Algol compiler, you know, for the scientific chapters. That was software, and they were formal of our tasks. But the enormous costs that Peter Hundred will tell us much more about later on, that was going to be incurred in supporting a range of machines in evidently enormously expanding market just hadn't been contemplated. And the other thing was, and this is where I think IBM were very far seeing, the huge investment that customers were beginning to make in the programs, their programs, and which they would want to preserve. It was so difficult to write programs with some of those early machines, you know, with hardly any storage and the like. But the idea of sort of preserving it for prosperity and building it up as an asset, a company asset, which, you know, eventually would become something you just couldn't alter, had not occurred to anybody. But IBM had realized these two things were crucial for the long-term future. And that was the reason that they took the gamble. But it was a gamble. They did just what I've said, no sensible car company would do. Obviously, the entire range with an announcement, in one announcement, as we shall see in a moment, was even rather more surprising aspects of that. So we had to act quickly, or so I believe. And to do this, we needed a machine that was in production, or at least close to it, and which would form the basis of a range. There simply wasn't time for a new range. There were, as Hugh has said, there were a number, and Peter has said, there were a number of teams within Ferranti, RCA, and ICT as well, who were looking for the ultimate solution, that order code which would outlast every other and become the lingua franca usually for the rest of time. So, the urgency of a response. The ability to deliver proven hardware quickly was important, and this was probably the key factor which ultimately led to the selection of the FP6000 as the basis of the range. And incidentally, I believe, it's been confirmed by what's already been said, probably hastened the ICT merger selection. The circuits that were actually chosen had a long lineage, surprisingly enough, although they were fairly advanced at that time. They originally developed in Wiltshire by one Morris Gribble, Peter, and in a good Ferranti manner therefore well established by the time Ferranti Packard chose them as the basis for the FP6000. In the event, this choice enabled the 1900 series to be announced in September '64, only 6 months after the 360 series itself. And in fact, it was delivered, surprising fact, earlier than IBM's range in many cases, particularly in the UK. Although we started late, we actually arrived a bit early. Speed up. I'll skip over the next one. Selection FP6000 I've largely dealt with. But it did have a number of limitations, and the main one, of course, was the addressing range. And it was necessary to find a way of amending the order code to allow larger addressing of larger stores. And it was no surprise, really, with all the indirect addressing schemes which were common with Ferranti at the time, that led to the adoption of the datum and limit system in the FP6000, which enabled large numbers to be addressed. The other area that required attention was peripheral interface and communications. Communications was something that hardly existed on machines at that time, and the concept of a standard peripheral interface was foreseen, certainly widely foreseen within ICT and Ferranti as being an important thing. And that really became one of the things which was heavily exploited in the marketing of the 1900 series later on. The box concept being able to put all these boxes together, as Tony J had suggested in the marketing presentation. And I think that way of simplifying the range and its ability to meet customer needs was an important part of the success of the 1900 series. We also recognize the need for an advanced operating system. Again, I shall only touch on that because George Felton will tell us much more about that later on. But experience with Atlas in particular had shown the need for a richer operating system that will be provided by an executive program, and one that met commercial as well as scientific needs. The first discussion of the requirements for this and its likely scope took place when Henry Goodman, one of George Felton's team at that time, visited the Ferranti planning section in Bracknell, which consisted of myself and Hugh and Virgilio Pasquale and Lynn Emery. But nobody envisaged at this stage the eventual expansion in the scope of what became the Jaws 3 operating system, which was largely customer driven. The other thing that we did start a little bit late last night. I know I might just go a couple of minutes over. That we had not appreciated was the size of the software support task, and I've already made mention of that. Peter Hunt's talk is going to be largely based upon that, so again I'll skip over that. The initial 1900 machines, the FP6000 with new software extended peripheral range became in 1904, scientific version 1905, and more powerful machines. These have already been mentioned. But I think it's just worth reflecting on the fact that stretching machines upwards, in particular, in that way, does create difficulties of complexity, and you're up against the limits of technology as well. But nevertheless, the other step of expanding the range downwards was even more difficult because of the cost restraints. However, a famous design session with Charlie Bolton, who's here, on his, I thought it was his kitchen table, he told me it was his dining room table or something of that kind, enabled us to convince ourselves anyway that a small machine would be possible at the cost. And it was decided to allocate that to Stevenage, who made a remarkable job of achieving cost objectives and a rapid timescale. My quite a big dealing with were alternatives to the FP6000, which I don't need to bother about because that again has already been mentioned. But the main one really came down in the end to should we have a copy of the IBM range or not via RCA, and it was rejected for marketing reasons. We did have a major bit of luck. In the event, that bit of luck was that IBM announced their system as expected in March '64, but with extremely long delivery periods. That gave us a delivery advantage as well as the cost advantage, the other important point, inherent in a 6-bit design based on proven hardware. They, of course, had the 8-bit byte. It was a major success, I believe, of the range that compatibility and enhanceability was achieved and rigorously adhered to. I really, even in retrospect, find that amazing that we did lay it down and it actually happened. I mean, with this bunch of people around, you can't imagine how difficult it must have been. Finally, it was an Achilles heel. Some features of the 1900 series, such as I've mentioned, such as the 6-bit characters, helped us greatly to achieve the competitive costs, but eventually were unable to meet growing communication and storage needs. So a new range had to come. But nevertheless, with direct machine emulation introduced to the new range.
My pleasure to introduce you to Julio Pasquale, who's going to talk to us about the interesting topic of keeping the 1900 range competitive. Julio, all yours.
Thank you. Right. I'm going to give you a thumbnail sketch of the initial 1900 range, how it evolved during the 10 years of its active market life after 1974, and how it related to competition during that time. I will look at it from the product planning point of view. Between 64 and 69, I was in product planning with crucial processes and systems, and therefore I will look at it very much at that sort of level of detail. Other speakers later will pick it up from the technical and architectural detail. Before starting that, I would like just to recall the sort of environment of the time. ICT, when it made a decision on the 1900 range, really faced a very, very significant challenge from the development planning point of view. It had to develop all its systems in-house. No way anybody else could actually give us 1900 system. The hardware and the software had to be developed in-house with the resources we had. And the span of the range, as Derek has said, more or less decided. ICT, at the time, I think, was #1 in the UK. Probably the only country in the world, the UK, where IBM was not the dominant supplier. And therefore, in order to maintain market credibility and avoid losing market share, ICT had to somehow offer a range that was roughly comparable, with an IBM range. But of course, as Peter Ellis just said, the IBM R&D spend was probably larger than our total revenue. The other factors to take into consideration is that ICT had acquired, the EMI had boosted its development resources, computer development resources, with the EMI computer expertise and the Ferranti computer department. Very good skills in West Gordon, people like Charlie Kaufman, Gordon Haley, Chris Burton, Keith Data, and all their teams from the around Atlas in Stevenage, Michael Forrest, Bill Talbot, Norman Brown, Ron Feather, and all their teams. So there were considerable skilled expertise. But we had never actually met each other by the time we started. And we just didn't know each other. And therefore, we didn't share a common system outlook, or never mind a common development methodology. Well, having been involved from the start, as I said indeed here, I can say with some confidence that the initial 1900 range did not suffer from the many years of careful planning of the IBM 360. We were doing a hell of a rush. IBM left the market opportunity open with their long delivery, and really moved very fast to capture that opportunity. And as Derek said, in 6 months after the IBM announcement, we were able to announce 7 1900 models, 18 peripherals, and a bunch of software, and demonstrate all the models at Olympia. And in fact, we delivered in April, I think April or May 1965, the year after. From the competitive point of view, looking at the positioning of the range in terms of performance, commercial performance, between ICL and IBM, ICT and IBM, sorry, at the beginning, we could see that in 1966, when the two ranges had settled down, ICT with the 1900 could match very well the IBM 360 in the middle and bottom of the range. In fact, with the introduction of the 1901, 1 year after the initial announcement, was reaching in the market parts of the market that the 360 could not reach. The IBM, the ICT 1900 at the time was projected on the value for money platform in the market. And for planning purpose, we used to assume a pricing of 5% below the IBM cost performance, price performance curve. So it was very competitive, but we thought we had a bit of a problem at the top. The 1900 was a simple architecture. It could not reach the commercial performance of the top of the IBM range. And that was a consideration that we were very much aware of and drove our system toward multiprocessors, and eventually it was one of the factors that took us into a new range. When I look at how the 1900 did compete in the 10 years of its life, take into account the difference in resources development between us and IBM, I really find it very hard to believe. In fact, it reminds me of a conversation I was having with one of these business gurus at a conference sometime way past. And I asked him what he thought of my company. And he said, well, your company is just like a bumblebee. According to theory, it shouldn't be able to fly like it does. Well, by 1974, ICT, or ICL as then was, had expanded the 1900 range very significantly, and the range with the 1906, with the S series and the T series, that was very much state-of-the-art technology, very good, rustling, competitively. And all that was done with the resources that, very small resources. Furthermore, has managed to introduce in 73 a 2903 that was introduced there to counteract the system 3 that appeared below. The N370 as it then was. And furthermore, was in developing 3 models of a new range, all that from those resources. To say, it's very difficult to believe that such a thing could be achieved. In fact, I think if we apply modern management techniques to it, we probably conclude that it wasn't possible, so we wouldn't bother. I would like to just look with you at some of the factors that I thought, from my position, a planning man, a product planning man, some of the factors that I thought were important for achieving this type of performance. Speed of implementation. We used to do things really very fast in those days. And the 1900 architecture was very open, very easy to modify. It was actually blessed by executive. It was a piece of software between the hardware and software and the rest of the software, developed by a team with the hardware people, and it used to present a compatible interface to the rest of the software. That enabled us to decouple hardware and software development and to change the hardware without a lot of propagate the changes up in the software. That was very important. And of course, range compatibility. We enforced range compatibility very, very strongly. There was a compatibility committee chaired by Bruce Patterson, who really was making sure that compatibility would not be breached. And many times during my planning activities, there was the opportunity to change the order code to get it better. After all, we're all from Ferranti, changing the order code. It was really our way of life, but we never did it, even if the product would not be as good as we could make it. Range compatibility was really very, very strongly enforced. Another advantage of executive, by the way, that I need to mention, was that we could actually deliver machines with executive without having to wait for the operating system. When we started in 64, we were planning to deliver machines in 65. No way we could get the George 3 in that time. Operating systems took some time. So we could deliver with executive, and that was a tremendous advantage. And IBM couldn't do that. They had to wait for the operating system to run into trouble. Modularity. The standard interface was the key components of modularity. The ICT standard interface that was actually developed by Ron Freda and Stevenage, I believe. And of course, as peripheral standard interfaces were not new at the time. They were known. I came across the first manifestation of the ICT standard interface, or a peripheral standard interface, in Ferranti, when I was working on the around peripheral subsystem. And Peter Hall, the manager of the Ferranti computer department, insisted that the Atlas and Orion tech decks should have the same interface. Unheard concept in those times. Really, most unreasonable. However, this standard interface was exploited not just in the market, and it was brilliantly exploited by ICT in the market, but from development as well. We were able to decouple all sorts of development and bring it all together at the end. Other interfaces developed, for instance, the processor store interface in the upper sub-range, and they were all propagated and eventually did help us a lot in achieving very fast deliveries. Rapid application of technology. We, of course, were not manufacturing our component technologies. We had people who scattered the world and got us the best technology they could get, state-of-the-art technology. And our developers became really skilled in applying that very quickly and intercepting trends. We will see that in a moment. Besides those 4 technical factors, there were 3 organizational factors that I think I must mention because they made our job so much easier. We started by not knowing each other in development. So the first machine we had to plan after the initial 1900, that was the 1901, we adopted working parties model work. The 1901 working party, we called together all the interest in the company that were to contribute to that. I remember Derek Erby was the chairman, I was the secretary, and Bill Talbot was the Stevenage representative, and he made a tremendous contribution. And we debated the thing, and eventually we arrived at a great proposal that we all believed could be done. The resources were in place, the development cost could be done, etc. We all wrote it down, and it was put up as a development proposal to the development committee. That was the final topic. 1 week before the meeting, the development committee was meeting about once every 6 weeks. And after the meeting, Tom Shepard used to rush down. He was the secretary of the development committee. He briefed us, okay, this is approved. And no hesitation, we knew exactly where we stood. All I needed to do is to make a few phone calls to West Gordon team and right, it's approved, off you go. And the project really were already fully understood, full commitment in all the units involved. I really had a running start. That was a tremendous achievement, and very soon we all got to know each other very well. And the focus of development. Because of resource constraint, we had to concentrate on the things that were just 1900 specific. And we started withdrawing from all the things that we could actually buy from outside. But I think that was some of the factors, no doubt some more will come during the day, that helped us in achieving such remarkable development performance. And I still, looking back, I cannot quite believe it. It was like that. That we actually did. When I started planning this seminar, I thought it would be a good idea to have a 1900 roadmap, putting down all the 1900 system models ever produced, dates, performance, etc., etc. So we did that. In courtesy of Brown Proctor, I have here a color slide of it. Now, I'm not going to talk about it. It's far too complicated, and therefore it will take too long. I put it up simply to give you a visual image of how the 1900 actually developed over between the period 65, 75, 80. I will extract from it some of the key dates and just talk at it from the planning point of view, rather than try to go through such a complete description. From the marketing point of view, the 1900 had 3 major phases. The initial announcement that we heard of, the A-series announcement, and the S-series announcement, with 3.5 years between each other. A life of a range was about 3 to 3.5 years before you need to replace it with replacement models. Then there was a set of key enhancement, tactical enhancement towards the end. By the way, 29th of January 68, 1,000 orders taken, just to give you an idea of the sort of quantities we're talking about. Well, just from the marketing point of view, from the development point of view, I think there were really two phases in the 1900 development. The first one was what I call the architectural phase. We had a 1900 architecture that not quite understood. And during the first phase, we took it, our developers took it up, down, see what we can do, changed, modified it, etc. Till we came out on the first phase with a really solid, well understood architecture and some template design that we could go on with confidence. And then we moved into the second phase that was to apply technology, advanced technology, very aggressively to that stable architecture, so that we did not have to change the architecture any longer, we only run the technological risk. The first phase, just to have a look, the sort of thing we developed in the first phase. After the initial range, the 7 models announced, as I said, we had to, the first thing we did, to design in 1901. To define in 1901. With the working party, the conventional wisdom at the time was that in order to go into that type of market, you had to have complex character handling in your instruction code, because it was replacing tabulators. And of course, the 1900 did not have any. But we proceeded anyway, and 1901 was really a very good machine, a very successful machine, done in Stevenage. In fact, it was so successful that we said, well, let's have another bite of the onion, let's go down another step into the market, and we assembled a working party, and we started planning a below 1900 machine. And again, it could be done, could be manufactured for the right cost, etc. You know, the working party was all agreed. It even had an interrogating typewriter to have online queries, a very advanced concept in those days. However, when we looked at the sales cost, assuming a reasonable hit rate, it just was not profitable with those sales costs. So we dropped it without even putting it to the development committee. And from then on, the 1901 became the effective lower limit of the range. And we revisited this area only in 1973 with the 2903, another 1900 compatible system. Sadly, we took the 1904 design, and we did all sorts of things to it, or Charlie did, I should say. We applied microprogramming, we extended all the code, etc. And even put paging, segmentation and paging on it as an option, supported by the George IV operating system. I remember calling in Frank Sumner from Manchester University, the Atlas experience, to help us to put this facilities in. But we did it all, and eventually we ended up with a fairly stable and good template for the architecture. In fact, it was so good that we said, well, let's take 2 of them together, because we want to go higher in the range. Let's put 2 of them together, make it a dual. The operating system can schedule all the work, so the customer can use it without quoting which machine to use. And the project is a new model, and we did that with the 678. And again, gave us valuable expertise on and in fact, we were so happy with it that we went into to design an Android. That was the time of the supercomputers. I don't know if you remember. Project 51, Project 52, the 3 white men, and all that. So we made our proposal, 4 machines together, sharing a common store, and a reasonable type of machine. We, however, of course, overtaken by event. so we did not do it. So we went into the second phase. I'm sure that will be covered by other speakers. All I want to say is that by that time, we had a clear understanding of what items in the architecture we were unable to correct, and therefore what items would necessitate changing by introducing a new range on the long term. Nothing wrong with the short term, but on the long term, we had to introduce a new range because those items eventually will not prove adequate. But of course, we were on a treadmill. We had 4 teams capable of developing 4 systems in parallel, and the development time was roughly the same time as the life of the system in the market. So we had to keep running to keep still and to keep those machines competitive, applying advanced technology. People say, well, you understand modularity, we understand the technology trend. So when we sat down designing the A series in 1966-67, we said, well, let's design it in such a way that modules can be replaced when the technology becomes available, and so that we give a B series without having to do all the volume all over again. That will free the resources to actually do something else. And we did that. In fact, from 4 machines, we derived all the products from the node. 6A to 6S with a faster store, 4A, 4S, etc. It really worked really nicely. And we were able to take the resources and take them, at least some of them, into other projects. The 2934 and the new range machine. Of course, by then, the merger with English Electric had happened, and therefore the requirement for a new range had required great urgency, and the requirement for a more complex new range was really coming to the fore. However, that is another story, so I will stop here next time.
I remember a personal anecdote in the Birmingham thought I decided the first systems of this new range, we certainly won't send overseas, let's have them in England. But the first 2 opportunities came to send them to Australia, and one can never lightly give up an order. But it was so important, the 1903 and the 1905 had to be dispatched about July 95. And then I spoke to Edgar about it, he said it's impossible. So I spoke to Peter Hall, he said it's impossible. So I said, well, Edgar says he can do it. Well, if he can do it, we can do it.
I always suspected something like that. Nobody ever actually told me. Yeah, we can have a sticky problem here. Well, I put getting Stevenage up to speed in inverted commas, because actually Stevenage looked at it as leading the way and hoping that West Gorton would follow as fast. And that, at a very early stage, taught me the great value of internal competition. A good but cooperative internal enemy is an extremely good way of pacing yourself. In fact, generally, internal enemies are helpful. Throughout my career, I was always grateful to whatever personnel department was involved with me for providing me with a free enemy at company expense. In the run-up to the period that we're really talking about, 63, 64 in particular, I was actually in West Palm Beach for a period of time,
working with RCA, trying to get the ICL standard interface onto the 2201. Looking back on this, I realized that my concern with computer technology was rather overshadowed by two other elements of technology, one of which was at least computer related, which was the Bryant fixed disk, which terrified everybody at West Lawton for fear it might break loose in the middle of the night when it was testing. The other thing that struck me about technology at the time was flying up and down between Philadelphia, Washington, and Miami in electras, which were famous for the characteristic of the turboprops coming off and spearing passengers in certain rows in the cabin. You could always lie out along those rows without fear of anybody else wanting to use them. It was a very useful thing. And I guess that the other thing I remember about Palm Beach basically was Dickie Bird and the butterflies and the alligators. So I thought, although it comes from a different continent, I would just put that up to illustrate the point. The 2201 was in fact an RCA project called Poplar, which to a Brit newly landed over there sounded as though it was named after a tree. It wasn't actually, it was named after a street in Philadelphia. I always wanted to find out what project was named after a street called Chestnut, because actually my mother lived on Chestnut in Philadelphia, and by a reasonable, if crude calculation, I was probably conceived there. So, I had great difficulty when preparing this talk in trying to work out what the timetable of events in 63 and 64 actually was. One of the things I consulted was the Martin Campbell Kelly book, in which on page 222 there is a fairly clear statement that the decisions to do everything were taken in April 63. I couldn't sort of fit that in with my mind, so I slowly came to the conclusion that that was earlier than it really happened, and the book was wrong. As a very much an afterthought, I noticed that there was a footnote to this paragraph about this, which referred to the back. So I thought I'd better look up and find out who had misinformed him of this. I was slightly surprised to get to the back to find it was based on an interview with me in 1988. So I haven't really any idea whether I have misadvised myself, but hearing other speakers this morning, I think I'm a little bit more confident that, so far as Stevenage is concerned, essentially the first inklings of what was going to happen did actually appear in April 1963. Interesting piece of acoustics. I will stop doing that. The other thing that I think perhaps fixes this is that the only records, historical records I ever kept were my own personnel data as a result of the various tiffs I had with personnel departments. And looking in a very, very dusty box, which somehow survived my wife's general policy of throwing things out when past their useful date, I find that I was complaining about the cost of telephone calls between West Palm Beach and London. I quote, "Charges reversed, dictation of PF 172 comments on standard interface, about 30 minutes, £30, 16 shillings and 0 pence, 3rd of April 1963. So fairly clearly, things happened in April 63, almost immediately following my return to West Palm Beach. I don't actually think anything happened because I returned, and in fact, in retrospect, I can't think why my boss actually signed my travel authorization to go over there. Because thinking about it, I don't actually think I did anything whilst over there. Later in 63, I became acting head of what was called, I think at that time, Stevenage Laboratories, and which, as Peter has eloquently described, was trying to do a number of disparate things, including ME4. I think otherwise known as PF172. At some point, as I say, in '63, I became head of that. On a quick count, that put me reporting to Echo Organ, who thereby became my 7th different boss in as many years. A further quick count suggests that I changed bosses once a year for almost the rest of my career. Why some of those bosses didn't realize the likely consequence of having me as their subordinate, I'm not quite sure. Now, in the run-up to the 1900s at Stevenage, we have very much there been involved in putting the standard interface onto a derivative of the 1301, called the 1302. That machine was, in fact, not only developed, given a type number, but was sold and was delivered. But I think, looking at, in retrospect, its role as a test bed for the standard interface, and therefore for the peripherals attached to it through the standard interface, must be enormously more important than its actual revenue earning role, even at the Department of Works or whatever it was called at Hastings, which I certainly remember having to go to in order to placate the customer. Indeed, my perception is that the standard interface was a really very important element in the 1900 series. That's been referred to already by Peter and Derek, and Hugh, I think, in fact, you can trace a succession from that standard interface through the various communications standards that followed, and even in a sense through Unix to the, perhaps more by accident than intention, compatible PC. The idea that you should try to make things easy for both the designer and the manufacturer on the one hand, and the customer on the other hand, with the same act, was probably pioneered by that standard interface, which in truth should be called, I think, the RCA ICT, or at least ICT RCA standard interface, though there's no doubt it was their intention to use it as well. If you look at, however, the history of the standard interface on the early 1900s, in practical terms, there was a downside, which was that, as Arthur referred to, some of the early machines went to distant parts, Brisbane in particular. But what was curious was that all those systems, the further away they were going, the more exotic combination of peripherals seemed to have got ordered. I think there's a logical explanation, which was that to sell a 1900 that far away was more difficult than to sell it in the UK, so you had to exploit the whole catalogue as hard as you could. The consequence for the developers was somewhat frightening. Now, as has been indicated several times, the 1902 and 1903 processor, which were really the same design with different core stop speeds, were allocated to Stevenage. And I think at that point, one should say that three things had already been fixed: standard interface, the order code, and the circuitry of the processor. There is a sample of the 700 series circuits over there, and as good as my memory is, that looks exactly what they were. And I think that it was absolutely key to what happened at Stevenage, and the speed with which it happened, and the relative, and I think even at the time it was obvious, lack of hassle that was involved in doing those developments, that those three things were fixed, absolutely. It stopped the hardware engineers in their tracks from reinventing everything every third Thursday. And it stopped the general, I have to say perhaps, general computer industry habit in those days of trying to be clever in every possible manifestation of every possible feature of a system, both hardware and software. There was, of course, another side to this, which was that there were a lot of
innovative people who, when faced with these three constraints, became initially very resistant and quite demotivated. I personally take the view that the very shortness of the development timetable available was the thing that rescued the operation from the downside of those constraints, because it dawned on people quite quickly that the constraints and the very tight timescale were in fact two sides of the same coin, and that only with those constraints could the timescale be met. And just to give an example of the tendency of people to be clever, one of the proposals that was made for limiting the costs of the 1902-3 processor was that where diodes on the gate circuits are not actually used in the particular instances of the board positions, when we got into full production, the unused diodes would be omitted, so that every card potentially was different. But of course, spares were provided with one with all the diodes in. Extremely fortunately, common sense intervened before one of the biggest logistic cock-ups I could ever imagine had time to happen. But it's certainly that recollection gels with the issue about the costs of the small machines. How do you extrapolate downwards and get a reasonable scaling of cost? And it's quite important to remember, I think, at this period in time, that the unit cost of hardware was not falling at that time in anything like the speed that we have become accustomed to in the PC, Spark, and all those eras. It was pretty static at that time. And the other thing that's worth remembering, has been touched on, is that at that time, the software people, programmers, were just starting to understand how to spend really big money. So the hardware people had to do two things. They had to do more for less, and they had to do it in a much more standard manner, so that the software people didn't bankrupt the company, and as we hardware people, as I then was, felt could be paid twice as much as us. The hardware people, I think, genuinely did try to help the software people. Sometimes the hardware people wondered, I think, why the software people didn't try to help themselves more. However, in this distinguished company, I won't carry on. Aside, therefore, from the constraints, what also made the process of getting things going in Stevenage possible? I was going to say easy, but that's rubbish. Possible. Well, I guess there were two things. One was the EMI team, which demonstrated how to work together almost by transference in a way that I had personally never seen before, and I doubt will ever quite the same be seen again. In a sense, you could say cynically that nothing concentrates the mind more than having your pet project cancelled under you at a very short notice. You have people who want to do something. They moved remarkably quickly onto it at Stevenage, and all credit to them. They certainly, and the way they behaved in those circumstances, were a key element. But also, I think, the way in which Stevenage was told to get on with it had quite an important contribution to make in this regard. I remember, and here I have problems with the date, because whenever I put this event, it doesn't quite fit with some of the evidence. The only thing is I absolutely know it happened. Both the processor and the peripheral people were called into the canteen at Stevenage and effectively told, this is what you're going to do. It's going to be a 1900 range. These are the givens. And Echo Organ spent about 5 minutes doing that, and then said, get on with it, looking at Bill Talbot, Norman Brown, and me, and one or two others standing around. I must say, in retrospect, it felt a bit like that. bit to the constraints. Basically, the standard interface said something very important. It said that if that peripheral works on the 1302, then if it doesn't work on the 1902.3, or doesn't work on the 4.5 or whatever, the 1902.3 or the 1904.5 had better be changed. Now that doesn't quite as draconian as it sounded, because what you actually went and changed was executive. And it's been mentioned that there's no doubt that the existence of the executive on the 1900s made a development possible that otherwise could not have been done in that period of time. There was an adapter in the middle that allowed both parties' hardware mistakes to be smoothed over and stuck together. But the manner of the announcement also convinced me of something else. Because if we had settled back and tried to calculate how long we really need to do the job, I'm sure we'd have come up with a calculation which would not have satisfied Peter Ellis's timescale, to say the least, let alone others. And I, in a sense, believe this as a result of that exchange. Lost bit required. Now, Cardinal Newman might not have known too much about the IT industry when he wrote that, but there was no doubt it was the words that made the people do it, not the logic of how long it really ought to take to do it. So, the standard interface, in a sense, disciplined both the processor people and the peripheral people. And although I was in charge of the processor people at Stevenage and not in charge of the peripheral people, despite regrettably having designed the photoelectric optics for two of the card readers, which in fact nobody ever forgot afterwards. It was in fact the peripherals that occupied the vast proportion of my personal time and probably of the management's anguish. We certainly were still learning then. Even the conventional peripherals like card readers were, what should we say, right at the limit of the physical capability of the medium. And nothing is as effective in teaching self-control and also the cussedness of inanimate objects as a high-speed card reader that has chucked all the cards all over the floor. One of the things we learned from Ferranti quite early on was it was a good idea to have the executive on paper tape, which could only get snagged and could be repaired with sticky tape, rather than on cards, which if the whole lot were dropped on the floor, it would take you 2 hours to sort them out again, and even then there would be one for the wrong place. But obviously, the Common Audit Code was a key issue as well. It created a situation, basically, where if the 1902.3 didn't run a program the same way as 1904, i.e. the FB6000 did, then you knew which half had to be changed. Just like the standard interface, you had a preset set of rules to tell you what was the mask and what was the product that the mask had to produce. You knew which to change. Again, executive was often the thing that was actually changed to fix a problem of that sort. I particularly remember, incidentally, our experiences with magnetic tape. At Stevenage, we used Potter tape decks and CDC tape decks. But CDC tape decks, not from Minneapolis, but from Paris. I'm trying to remember. But perhaps the most striking characteristic was the personalities of our two interfaces in that organisation. The Potter sales manager or sales director, I remember on a trip that Arthur and I made, which ended up in Puerto Rico, where Potter had set up a factory, consisted, among other things, of said sales director sitting on the arm of Arthur's plane seat and making both of them excruciatingly uncomfortable throughout the whole journey. Why said person in Potter thought this was a good sales technique, I've never worked out. I also remember that that journey was very good at training a junior manager in the correct way to behave when he and his managing director had played in the same casino. And he had made what seemed to me to be an enormous sum of money. To my horror, I discovered I'd lost almost exactly the same amount. It became rapidly clear that there was no contract between me and my managing director, only separately between me and the casino management and him and the casino management. The CDC tape decks had mechanical tape buffer arms. It didn't take anybody who could write a sort program or less long to exploit the resonances in these, to bring them to a dead stop with tape all over the floor. Our contact there, his name was Oscar Citrine. To my amazement, amongst my personnel records, I find I have a letter from him in French inviting my wife and I to go and spend New Year's Eve with him in his apartment. That was a marvellous occasion, but I can assure you that the tape decks didn't somehow live up to that experience. Now, quite obviously, at some point, and I can't be exactly sure when, the fixed date of the Olympia Business Efficiency Exhibition descended upon us as something that had to be met. It wasn't quite as clear-cut as one might think. I believe there were several weeks of argument as to whether it was possible or not. I certainly possess a letter from Echo Organ which says, "You get on with it, we're Scotland still arguing," I suggested. But once it was set, we really did have to meet that date. I don't think anybody at Stevenage really contemplated not meeting it. Quite why we met it, it is impossible for me to work out, because logically, even now, it seems slightly impossible to have done. I do remember long hours. I do remember moving from my home to a hotel in Stevenage so that I could be called in at short notice. I also remember that the engineers, obviously making the right judgment about management, never did actually call me in from the hotel. And because the Stevenage main exchange in those days was manual, in order they could, one of the outside lines was plugged through to me in my hotel room, and I took 5 bookings at the hotel throughout the night. I was never called in to do anything. I'm quite sure that by keeping out of the way, I allowed the process of people to get on with it, and I actually put my main effort into trying to get peripherals from my colleague, you see me, from my colleague across the Secretary's office, Brian Maudsley, to get peripherals to meet the requirements on 13F2. So, maybe I didn't actually contribute at all to the process. Maybe that is the real secret of success. Now, I do realize that the Business Efficiency Exhibition, important as it was probably in no sense halfway to getting the first customer deliveries. The subsequent production introduction and manufacturing process was actually very much more fraught than the development process. And somehow or other, we got ourselves through that. There was at least one scurrilous item in an ICL anthology book about my behavior in the middle of the night with a live printer, which I can assure you is all completely untrue. But we did, as Arthur said, the first ones actually went to Australia. I think at this point in time, I certainly remember the ones that did go to Australia. I've not mentioned 1901 because in reality that emerged after I'd left Stevenage. Somebody pushed me via manufacturing into sales, and when I was in sales, there was an interesting sting in the tail as far as I was concerned, which was that I was selling to universities and research organizations, and later course, the 1900 was in competition with System 4 and System 4's predecessors. When I moved into planning, I went to visit one of these research organizations, and instead of drawing their wisdom about what might be applied to ICL's future products, I received an hour's tirade for having been such an incompetent salesman that I'd allowed them, by failing to reject the merits of Trent 1900, to buy a System 4, and now look at all the problems they had. Now, I did actually undertake this, Julia's request, with some reluctance. I believe that looking back, created some real problems of acknowledging whose contributions were key. I am very conscious of the fact that this talk does no justice to such. But I will mention two names, neither of whom are with us at all now. They're dead, Bill Talbot and Ron Fenner. I believe those two names are very important in the history of this. Other than that, I think the only thing I would put up is that.
Ladies and gentlemen, certain precision in the timetable, and it's pretty well spot on to quarter to one. We now have a break for lunch and to the 1900 architecture. Thank you very much.
I have to say that I have a slight feeling that everything I'm going to say has been said at least twice already. This is a try. Let's see if it comes out upside down. No? Okay. I do have a slight apology, and that is I've prepared these slides with Microsoft PowerPoint, and those of you who are familiar with it will know it insists on telling you how to do it. It wants to know what sort of presentation you're going to make, like delivering the type of news or so the style is by Brian Proctor out of PowerPoint. Brian and I are going to share this talk between us. So I'm going to start by giving you briefly what I think my credentials are, why I ought to be standing here talking at all.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
I could try. Or I could. I don't think I'm allowed to do that. It's all right, yes, there's a man who knows how to do it. Is that any better? Yes? Good. Okay, and then I'm going to spend a little time talking about the FP6000, because, as clearly said during the morning, it is the foundation of the 1900 range. And then I propose just to mention a few salient facts about the 1900 range where it differs from the 6000. As I said, a certain amount of repetition is inevitable. That's me. I was trained as an electronic engineer. In fact, when I joined the course, it was a light current engineering course. I joined Ferranti as a circuit engineer, worked on magnetic drums and relay circuits and circle amplifiers and things like that. And I got into logic design really through the testing of drum subsystems. The size of storage on drums necessitated some sort of automatic testing system, and it wasn't sufficient to read the odd word by hand and see whether it was logical for a few seconds before you had to do all sorts of elaborate work. That's where I got into the logic design field. I worked on Newt, which was the neural test bed, on Sirius under Ryan, and eventually became manager of the 1900 development lab, where the 459 machines were developed from Packard's FP6000. We went on to do the 906 and 7, the 4E and its variants, dual 4E, page 4E, all of which, of course, have already been mentioned. about architecture, so I'm going to try to describe the main components of the system really above the detailed hardware level. I'm certainly not going to talk about circuits, but I'm not even going to talk about internal registers and highways and things like that, for reasons which I hope will become apparent, not just because it's difficult to get hold of diagrams. The really crucial issue is, of course, to do with what an object program sees as the machine in which it's run. That's where the software investment is, that's where the user is going to want to carry the software up to the next more powerful machine as his business grows. That's where the manufacturer gets out of having to write different compilers for different machines in the range, and even some parts of executive can be carried from machine to machine. So I start off by putting up a diagram. I'm quite proud of this, I chose the topics for that. Oh yes, I did. I was thinking, what are all these words? I'll try that again. Yeah, that seems to be good. The all-important user programs. The machine that the user program sees consists partly of executive and partly of the hardware. The hardware got registers and flags and microprograms and what in it. It obviously has a store. There are I/O channels, and on 1900s, at least on Epic 6000, there was a typewriter, actually a teletype 33. And on early Ferranti Packard machines, there were a wide range of peripherals, including phones, chip sorters, and alone knows what, which were connected through the I/O channels. The 6000 was in fact designed as a microprogrammed machine. And if you looked at the Ferranti Packard documentation, you could see sequences of pseudo instructions which described how the conceptual inner machine dragged the data between the registers and shipped it about and so on. In the actual implementation, the microcode was hardwired. It was made out of ordinary logic elements. There wasn't a microcode store as we know in the boring later on. Now, this is the technical bit. And as you all know, the Epic 6000 had a 24-bit word. That 24-bit word was used in a wide variety of ways, and on the Ferranti Packard machine, the decisions on the way in which that word was split up were, of course, fundamental to what happened in the future. The bits in the word, interestingly to me, who had come from a background of serial computers, are numbered from the most significant end. Some of our serial computers, in fact, they were numbered both ways. The program was numbered one way, the engineers were numbered the other. This led to various interesting results. The machine was a 2-component machine, so the top bit, the naught, was worth 2 to minus 23. A word might hold 4 6-bit characters. It might hold an instruction, and in fact there were 2 variants of the basic instruction format. The first one, the so-called normal instruction, had a 3-bit X field, which addressed the accumulator, a 7-bit function field, which allowed you to describe, select from a large number of functions, a 2-bit N field, which was allowed you access to 3 modifiers, and the 12-bit address field, and it's that 12-bit address field which is crucial, of course. An unmodified normal instruction can only address 495 words in store, thus creating what I think was called in plan the lower data area. Branch instructions were cunningly always even numbered. There are no odd numbered branch instructions. This gave, and since branch instructions were not modified, this gave them an extra 3 bits, a 15-bit address, so the last instruction could be in 32767, and no further could the program go. When a modification of the address field took place, it was extended to 15 bits, and this allowed the Canadians to do clever things like these two, to use the top 9 bits as a counter, or in the case of counter modification, a 7-bit counter or 2-bit modifier. Anyway, enough of that. So the other bits you must remember, the 15 bits, the 32,000. Let's just talk for a moment about the program's environment. The user program saw a consecutive set of 24-bit words numbered from 0 upwards, certainly not past 32,767. Words 0 to 7 were known as accumulators and were accessed by the X field, and words 1, 2 and 3 could act as modifiers. If you're interested in reading the word 0 as not a modifier, is so that you could not modify. Otherwise you would have to have kept 0 in word 0 and then you could have not modified at a great expense. The important thing to notice is that these accumulators and these modifiers are the same addresses as main store addresses 0 to 7. They are not a different set of space. The user program has not got a separate set of accumulator registers. Now, this has a number of consequences. For example, you can do accumulator arithmetic by pretending you're doing store arithmetic. You can add the end field into an accumulator. You can add the contents of any store address, including the accumulators, into an accumulator. So it simplifies the order code in that sense. Through the modified end field, by putting in one of the 3 accumulators a 15-bit address, you could modify any of the normal instructions to access up to 32,767. And there was, in fact, a pre-modified instruction. Was it called a pre-modified instruction, which was the same number as in the line, which allowed you to add a further modification, allowed you to do sort of 2-dimensional addressing. The function bits in the hardware part of the order code were decoded to slightly usual functions like copy and clear, add and subtract and shift and so on. Jumps with testing of carry and sign, overflow class operation, and counter modified jumps are also provided. Further functionality through a set of extra codes which behave to the object program exactly like hardware implemented instructions, performed operations like assigning peripherals, performing data transfers, sending messages to the operator, and about other useful things. These extra codes were assigned perfectly normal function numbers. As far as the program was concerned, they were written as and behaved just like ordinary instructions. The hardware turned all of them, lock, stock and barrel, into interrupts and sent them to executive. The user program was stopped until the number of flags were dumped in word 8 of its own code store area, which control was transferred to executive, which eventually returned the result. When executive was running, a mode switch was set which gave executive direct access to the hardware of the peripheral channels, which the user program, of course, did not have. And that's an important aspect of the protection. Coming on to talk about protection, one of the things to be recalled is that the FP6000 was designed as a multi-programming machine. In fact, it was designed to run 4 programs concurrently. I never found anything in the machine except the lights on the typewriter, which knew about this faults. I mean, why not 5 or 17 or 22, whatever number you want. But the typewriter had 4 lights on it and they lit according to which program was running. So ignore that. Because the machine was designed to run 4 programs, as it were, concurrently, it was necessary to make sure that programs didn't interfere with each other, normally executive, regardless of which 4 programs they were and or in which order they were loaded. Now, nowadays we're perfectly used to this, but it was, in those days, it was like newish stuff. Orion did it, and Atlas did it, and obviously FP6000, which was contemporary, also did it. At the risk of slightly quarrelling with one of my previous talkers, the data and limit facility was there to separate the address spaces of the object programs. Each object program was allocated a data, a place in the store where word 0 would be, and the limit was calculated by adding that number onto the declared size of the program. And that program was, by hardware, but through a special piece of hardware called the reservation checker, was constrained to that space. And that's a very important way of doing it, because the object program code does not know that this is happening. The program can be loaded on different days in different locations. The difference, in fact, you can stop the program and move it. Other schemes for achieving the same end have been tried. For example, adding the data during the loading process, because that doesn't allow you to move the program dynamically, at least not without messing around. Executive itself ran normally, at least, with the data of 0 and no limit, so executive, of course, had to be trusted. possible area of interference between two programs, of course, is through the peripheral channels. If two programs seize a card radio, each demand to leave cards, and the knows what will happen. It was also supposed to be a bit like the picture that Mike Forrest painted for all the cards being scattered over the floor. This is handled quite simply, really, because the executive allocates the peripheral channels. It won't allocate the same unshareable peripheral to two programs, and so that particular issue is covered. As far as the program is concerned, it was my unit of number N, number X, of type N, and therefore the carding, which might be a different company on a different day, is still addressed by programming just the same way. Okay, what I've done there is just quickly run over a few features of the FP6000, which I think are considerable relevance to what happened later. Now, the two fairly early changes that were made to the 1900 have again been mentioned by previous speakers. The ICT standard interface was a major change. It was somewhat traumatic. One of the things which I don't think was mentioned this morning was that the early implementations of coupling the standard interface into the FP6000 internal structure, which we did on 1904, were actually more expensive than the Ferranti-Packard coupling of some of the simple peripherals. So, in other words, we didn't actually pay a price on simple peripherals for doing this. And of course, I mean, by the general law of cussingness, if you take a peripheral here and a piece of logic there, and you divide the logic you're going to build into at some well-defined point, they always cost more. The whole thing will always cost more on a one-off costing basis. But I totally agree with everything that was said this morning about the advantages of the standard interface, both in terms of stopping people arguing and in terms of the advantages to manufacturing, to the salespeople configuring systems, in focusing the attention of the developers on the relevant bit. And of course, on-site enhancement and indeed certain aspects of maintenance were also considerably eased by the presence of standard channels which could be designated to carry different sorts of peripherals at the time at which we decide to add the peripheral. That change really, apart from a bit of tidying up and the physical re-engineering of the machine, which is actually quite a story in its own right, were the main things that we did to turn the 6000 into the 1904 and 1905. The enhanced addressing changes, of course, didn't appear in that first machine, but they were the other major feature which got us out of the addressing straitjacket. Even at the time that the first FP6000 came to us, core stores of 16K words per module were commonplace, 32K words per module were imminent on the horizon, and there were threats of even bigger stores. Meanwhile, of course, the size of programs was growing, and the ability to multi-program 4 programs was rapidly becoming theoretical in the sense that if you only had 32K, you weren't going to get 4 programs in them anyway. So the pressure was on to do something about that. Again, as has been said, we have in Ferranti a lot of experience with direct addressing in a wide variety of machines, and it wasn't difficult, in principle, to modify the order code through a mode bit so that we could revert to the original compact mode machine. It wasn't difficult to modify it to provide the two features that gave us the enhanced addressing. Essentially, we devised a modifier word or address word with 22 bits in it, and we extended the scope of the addition to the address so that you could have the 22-bit
number to whatever the head of the was. Now then, I just want to run over what my ideas of what are the features of a range are, and this is the list that design. It should be compatible in the senses that we've been talking about. It should be possible to have a range of power so that the customer can choose the range and then select the machine the right power so that we can upgrade. Flexibility, so that when the customer says, yes, I'll buy one of your machines, it's got to have a Sonostronic printer. That was a right match, because it did happen. Or Xeronic printers. That there is a way of doing it. There needs to be the enhancement part. And above all, it needs, the system needs to pay attention to the reliability and availability issues. That's actually another story. It's nearly not an architecture story at all, that last one. Okay, I just mentioned a couple of other features and I'll hand over to Rob. We did, as has been mentioned, produce multi-processor systems, and that again was done in a way which was essentially transparent to the object programs. It wasn't transparent to executive, or indeed, as I remember it, not quite transparent to George III. But it was the impact was confined to a relatively small area of those operating systems. From a hardware point of view, it was interesting and challenging piece of work. Again, theoretically not very difficult, but in practice, a certain amount of midnight oil and so on was involved. Page processors, I mention that because